Hello there and welcome to Lesson 9, Writing Analysis. So since Lesson 6, we've been working on our paper, your final paper for the class, bit by bit, piece by piece. Lesson 6, I introduced you to the paper. Lesson 7, we went through how to find good pieces of research. Lesson 8, we went over how to discern if those pieces of research are credible. In addition to the research component, the other major component of this paper is really the biggest part of the paper, where you analyze the cultural artifact. So the goal of this lesson is to help you see how to do that. Now, you've already written a rhetorical analysis in this course, so you've got some familiarity with analysis under your belt. But we're going to take a greater, more in-depth look at it in this lesson. Specifically, how do you analyze an artifact to prove your argument about the real world issue, because that's what you're doing here. It's a little bit different than when you're just analyzing it to see what message it conveys. Here you're taking it and using it as evidence to prove your own point, your own argument. So that's a little bit different. We'll look at how to do that. But the way I'm going to approach that is through breaking apart, analyzing a student example to show you how to do it, and we'll look at that paper as a whole. So in addition to seeing how to write analysis, you'll also see how to integrate the research you've done into the paper, and that's something we haven't talked about yet. We've talked about how to find research and how to make sure it's credible, but this is really important. Like, what the heck do you do with the research in the paper? So we'll see that as well, because this is really a holistic look at one student example. So in the first part of the lesson, we'll review the assignment prompt, so we have really fresh in our minds what are you supposed to do for this assignment. And then in the second half, we'll pick apart that example paper and apply what we've studied in the first half. See, how does this meet the assignment requirements? And again, hopefully that'll give you an idea of how to really get started on your own paper by seeing some examples. And I've given you 3 sample papers to read this week, so the discussion board is to take one of those other 2 and do the kind of analysis I do in part 2 of this lecture, so that you get a really thorough breakdown of 2 example papers and what they do well, and that you've done one of those analyses yourself, so that you're really familiar with what I'm looking for this paper, so that you can go and then write a great paper. So let's get started. I've used this picture here because it's actually from the student sample, and the student sample is about the issue of homelessness and how the movie, and really the life story the movie's based on, the film called The Soloist, how that engages this issue of homelessness, which, as you probably don't have to look very far, either out your window or just drive or walk a little ways to see how much this issue plagues our city, our state, and our country right now. So before we get to the student paper, though, let's review the assignment prompt. We're going to do 2 things in the part of this lecture. The first part is just a really quick review of what the assignment prompt asks you to do, so that that's fresh in your minds, because we haven't looked at it since Lesson 6. And then in Lesson 6, we looked at the first few pieces of the assignment prompt. We didn't look at what I call the criteria for success, or the rubric, which is basically what I use to evaluate you on the paper. So at the end of this part 1, we'll look at that rubric, and that's where we'll really spend most of our time, since the rest of part 1 is review. And what we'll do is we'll extrapolate 4 to 5 specific things from that rubric that we can use to evaluate the student paper, basically asking, does it do these things? Kind of analyzing the rubric to come up with a little more clearly defined, succinct criteria that we can use in practice as we study the sample papers. So to start off, let's review the task really quickly. Take a clear stance on an important real-world issue and analyze a cultural artifact of your choice, for example, a novel, film, show, comic book, video game, etc., as evidence to prove your argument. You should be pretty familiar with this because you've been doing research, and so you had to have an idea of what you wanted to write on to do that research. But to sum up, there's basically 2 layers to the paper: the real-world issue and the cultural artifact. The real-world issue is what you're really making the argument about, but you need evidence to prove your argument, and you could use all kinds of evidence, statistics, surveys, scientific research and facts, but I think we need to become more innovative and creative in the 21st century, especially in 2022, and it's just plain old more fun to use pop culture as the evidence. So that's where the cultural artifact comes into play. It is the evidence that supports your stance, your thesis on the real world issue. And I always like to include on my assignments, why are we doing this? You gain rhetorical knowledge. Remember, rhetoric is the ability to communicate, to persuade, to create change. So you learn how to do this better. In the first half of the quarter, we spent learning how to do rhetorical analysis. So we were basically learning how do other people create change? How do other people persuade people? What strategies do they use? And that's really valuable because studying that can help us figure out how to hone and develop our own strategies. But now that you're making your argument using a text of your choice to support that argument, now you get to develop your own rhetorical strategies. And that's one of the main reasons why we're doing this assignment this way. You also gain some important skills, such as argument. We write to create change, to persuade people to think differently about the real world issue. I've heard argument defined as persuading someone to think differently. That's an example of creating change. So think of an audience here that's neutral or maybe even opposed to your stance. How are you going to convince them to agree with you, to maybe even change their mind? If you can learn to do that, that is a great skill to have in your toolbox, because you can now go into any writing situation in another class, applying for a job, going on a job interview, many of the writing situations you'll face once you have your job, your career, your dream job. So you need to learn how to create change, to learn, rhetorical skills. That'll help you well beyond this class, and this assignment will help you do it. And evidence. Analysis is how we prove arguments. So if we want to create change, what is one of the main ways to do that is to present evidence and explain how that evidence proves the point we're trying to make. You use analysis to persuade people to agree with the argument you're making. So again, these are the foundational skills you learn here that can help you elsewhere. Okay, that was all review. That's why we moved quickly there. What we haven't looked at from the assignment sheet yet is the rubric, the things I'll actually evaluate you on. And what you'll notice is if you look at this part of the assignment sheet is these are short sentences, much shorter than the ones we just read, because I want the rubric to function almost like a checklist. You should definitely read it before you do your rough draft and your final draft, so you really have a good idea of what I'm looking for. But then, when you're going from rough draft to final draft, and before you turn in your final draft, since they're short sentences, use it like a checklist to make sure that you have all of those things. But we haven't gone over it in detail, so that's what we're going to do now. And really the goal here is not just for me to read these statements and explain them, but for you and I together to analyze them. Like, read these statements, and then when I'm done reading them, think about, okay, based on that, what are 3, 4, maybe 5 things I should really be looking for when I evaluate that student paper? So here are the statements. Make an argument about the real-world issue that you support with thorough analysis of the cultural artifact. So this is like a one-sentence summary of what I'm asking you to do in the paper. Begin with an introduction that contextualizes and introduces your topic and argument. So you don't want the first sentence in the paper to be your thesis statement, because people will be like, huh? What are you talking about? They'll be confused of why you're going to something so specific so soon. So give just a little bit, not much, but a little bit of background and context to set up your thesis, and then end the introductory paragraph with a unique or creative thesis. So a little bit of context in the introductory paragraph with your thesis, so it's the freshest thing, the most recent thing in the reader's mind as they read the rest of the paper after they move on from your intro. But the thesis should also be unique or creative. It shouldn't just be a repeat of the research that's already out there. So we've talked some in the last few lectures about doing research as a way to come up with a unique or creative thesis, because you see what's already out there and you figure out what new perspective you can add that hasn't been covered in the research. So that's great. But if readers are unfamiliar with our topic, how do we show readers that our thesis is unique? That's where the research comes into play. So here's my statement on the rubric about your research. Paraphrase and synthesize the arguments of the secondary sources to show how they engage with each other. Then, explain what new, unique, or creative insights your argument adds to this conversation. So you basically sum up what the sources say, making connections between them, showing how they're talking to each other. Then you join that conversation by adding to it, saying, what they have overlooked is this, my thesis, which is really important. And that can seem very abstract. Like, how do I do that? So I think seeing a student example will really help illustrate that. But this is important, because if you ask other students or even professors, why do I do research? How do I use research in a paper? The answer you'll most often get is to back up your stance. And that's partially true. The research definitely supports what you say. But if you stop there, you don't need to be writing a paper. Well, I mean, why would you write a paper if you're just saying what other people have said? Someone else has already said that. So moving beyond just backing up your ideas, the real main reason we do research is to show how our argument is unique. And again, the student example will help you really see this when we get there. So this is the intro with a thesis, and then the part of the paper where you kind of sum up the research you've done. Now moving on to the most important part of the paper, where you analyze the artifact to prove your argument. What should that part of the paper have? Provide clear claims or arguments at the start of each body paragraph. So this is what we call topic sentences. Little mini claims or little mini arguments that prove your thesis. Basically, the list of reasons why your thesis is true. You make each one of those the focus of its own body paragraph, and in the opening sentence of that paragraph, you state the little mini argument. Why? Because if you wait till later in the paragraph, the reader won't know what the paragraph is about. So be sure it's the first sentence of the paragraph, and be sure it's an argument, just like the thesis, not a fact, not a question. You can then go on and develop your argument logically and clearly, supporting all claims with evidence. So you go on and you analyze the cultural artifact to prove the argument from the opening sentence of your paragraph. And since the argument from the opening sentence of your paragraph is a little mini claim, a supporting reason that proves your thesis, by analyzing the artifact to prove that mini claim, you subsequently also prove your thesis. This is why analysis is so important, and why structuring your body paragraphs in this way is so important. You also want to connect your claim, your little mini thesis, back to the central thesis. Right? If your statement is, my thesis is true because these reasons, and then you do a body paragraph, like one body paragraph on each of those reasons, you don't want the connection to your thesis to be just implicit. You want it to be explicit, stated overtly. So take a place to do that in the paragraph, and usually the final sentence is a great place to do that, and we'll see that in the student example. Also, avoid summary. So, like, this student is writing about a film, and he does a really good job of giving a short, I think it's just 4 to 5 sentence summary of the film's plot in the second paragraph of the paper, which is really helpful for people who haven't seen the movie. But the plot of almost any movie is complex enough that you could spend 3-4 paragraphs, basically the whole length of the paper, summing it up. And I've read papers where students do that, and I just want to be clear that that's not what I'm asking you to do on this assignment. I'm asking you to make an argument and prove it through analysis. So summary does not prove arguments, analysis does. So keep the summary to really minimum, maybe 4 to 5 sentences after your intro or after you present your research, just so people know what happens in the text you're analyzing. Maybe 1 or 2 sentences per body paragraph if it's a particular scene you're focusing on, if you're doing a film or a show. But really, that's it. The rest should be argument and analysis so that you prove your argument. Summary does not prove arguments. Use logical structure and organization to the paper. So these little mini claims, these topic sentences that prove your thesis, you want to put those in an order that makes sense. So take some time, think about it, and this one first, this one next, this one third, so on and so forth, because. You don't have to tell that to the reader, but just have thought about it so that when they read it, it all flows and makes sense. You also want to consider and refute plausible objections to your argument. Your argument needs to be an argument. Your thesis needs to be an argument, not a question, not a fact. So that means some people out there in the world are going to disagree with it. Envision those readers. At some point in the paper, there's various places you could do this, and we'll look at how this student example does it. You could do it all throughout, as long as you're not doing too much. A lot of people like to add a final paragraph after the body before the conclusion to do it there, and that's great, but really, like I said, you could do it anywhere. But this is important because you want to give that other side of the argument a fair shake, represent their view fairly, to show that you're not biased and that you know the topic, that you've done your research. But then, much more importantly, you want to refute it, as I say there. Show the flaws in that argument. You can present it fairly and still show the flaws in it. If you just present it fairly, the reader will think you've wandered off topic and you're now changing your stance. So present it fairly and then critique it. Show the problems with it. Because you have the view that you do for a good reason, which means you can explain the problems with the other side. And you need to have thought that through to be able to have a good thesis. Of course, grammar, spelling, punctuation. Students ask me, how much of a role does this play in the paper? I usually say, as long as I can read the paper from beginning to end without stopping, 100% in this category. If I have to stop and reread a sentence or two because I don't know what they mean because of how you've structured the sentence, that's where you might lose some points here. And again, it'll depend on the degree to which, how frequently I have to do that. But this is usually a very small portion of the grade, if at all. Finally, in your conclusion, you don't have to do a lot. The conclusion should be the shortest paragraph in the paper. You do not want the conclusion to be longer than any body paragraph or even longer than the intro. All you're doing in the conclusion is wrapping everything up, like a Christmas present, beautifully wrapped with a nice bow for the reader. You can certainly make connections, tie up loose ends, but you do not need to restate every topic sentence. That's not necessary. And where the conclusion can really be beneficial is you can say why your topic's important. I call this the so what factor. So people should care about this. You're passionate. You're writing about it for a reason. Show that to the readers. You can do that many places throughout your paper. But the conclusion is a really great place to do it. It's a great way to end the paper by saying, this matters because. So if we were doing this lecture, this discussion in a brick and mortar classroom, what I would do at this point is pause the lecture. Well, what I would do at this point, I'm actually going to ask you right now to pause the lecture. Sorry. What I would do in a classroom is I would put this rubric, this criteria for success on the screen and say, okay, now come up with 4 to 5 things. Like condense this to 4 or 5 things we're looking for. Work on this in groups and then we'll share as a whole class. We can't do that, obviously, here. I wish we could. So that's why I'm asking you to pause the lecture and jot down 4 or 5 things in your own words you think this rubric says that I, as the instructor and ultimate grader of this paper, am looking for. And then in a few minutes we'll unpause and see how what you wrote matches up to what I wrote. But I want you to do some reflecting on, thinking on this yourself too. Okay, here's how I've condensed it, and these are the things I've listed on the discussion board for Lesson 9 on Canvas. So in a minute, I'll turn and I'll look for these 4 or 5 things in the student example, but for the discussion board, I want you to look at a different student example and look for those 4 to 5 things there. A clear stance on the real-world issue at the end of your introductory paragraph. So it needs to be, the thesis needs to be a stance, not a question, not a fact, and it needs to be at the end of your intro, ideally the last sentence, so it's the freshest thing in the reader's mind when they read the rest of the paper. You need to incorporate your research, and there's 3 things you do with that. Make connections between the sources, show how your argument joins that conversation, because the sources are talking to each other, and show how your argument adds a unique perspective to that conversation. Use the research to show the uniqueness of your argument. Multiple body paragraphs, so more than one, at least 2 or more, with clear topic sentences, little mini arguments that prove your thesis, and thorough analysis of the artifact, so that when you prove the arguments from those topic sentences, you prove your thesis. That is basically summing up the longest portion of the paper in one short sentence for you. Finally, a conclusion that briefly wraps everything up. So I just try to make what we looked at on the last few slides more succinct, more brief, concise for you. Hopefully that's helpful. I'm going to look for these specific things in part 2 of the lecture. And again, you can look for them in the discussion board when you read one of the other sample papers. So this sample paper, the real world issue is homelessness, and the cultural artifact is The Soloist, which is a movie about homelessness. One quick point I want to make is this sample paper does some things very well, and so do the other sample papers, and I want you to see how the sample papers do those things well to give you an idea of how to start crafting your own versions of those things. For instance, thesis statements, topic sentences, analyses, integration of research, etc. That's what I mean when I say things. But these are not templates for you to copy precisely and just, input your own information in the same exact way. Not everybody's going to do the same thing the same way. There's more than one way to go about everything. But I don't want to not give you examples. You need kind of a demonstration. I think that's only fair, more than fair. So that's what we're doing here. But this paper is flawed. The other sample papers are flawed. Every paper I've written and every paper you've written is flawed. There's no such thing as a perfect paper. I'll try to point out the flaws too when I can to reiterate that, but our main focus here is seeing good examples of the things I'm asking you to do so that you can learn how to do them yourself. And you'll see how if we had more time, we'd look at all 3 sample papers together, but that'd be a really long lecture and you'd get really bored, more bored than you are now. So in looking at the other papers on your own, hopefully you'll see how even in just 3 examples, the writers do these things: thesis statement, topic sentence, analysis, integration of research, etc., a little bit differently. Because there's more than one way to do it, but seeing a few good examples, again, will help you figure out how to do it yourself. So let's get started with that. The introductory paragraph, I've mentioned a few times, should start with some background and context before you get to your thesis. We call that the hook and the bridge. The hook, people think I have to be really clever in the opening sentence to get the reader's attention. You don't have to be really clever. You just have to present general enough information that what you say could be interesting to anybody. And this student does a good job of that when he says, in the United States of America, there are more than 500,000 homeless people living without a residence on any given night. So that's attention-getting. It's a statistic, but it's not overly clever. The student found it from the source he cites here. So it's general information like, okay, I'm going to read more about this. But it's not really clever or witty. It can be, but don't feel pressure. Just present something general enough that anybody will be interested. If it's general, you need to get to your thesis eventually, and your thesis has to be very specific. So you move from the general to the specific. We call this the inverted triangle because it gets narrower rather than bigger as you go deeper. So you get slowly more specific as you go through the intro. So you go from kind of the general topic to your specific issue to eventually in the final sentence a stance on it. So how does this student build a bridge from the opening hook to the thesis? Of these people, 1/3 has a mental illness. So of these people is kind of a transition phrase. 1/3 is a mental illness. Now we're more specific. That contributed to their living situation, a reason why they're homeless. Many people live with mental health issues and don't receive the care they need until after their condition becomes critical. This is a result of how the American healthcare system focuses on treating illnesses rather than preventing them. In addition to this country has decided to rely on finding a quick fix instead of understanding and treating the root of the problem. So, opening statement, a statistic about homelessness that gets people's attention. A little more specifically, this is one of the causes of it, and the issue here is that we're just trying to fix the symptoms. We're not trying to fix the root cause. So a little bit more specific, this is what, you could write thousands of different papers on homelessness, so the bridge, the second part of the intro, shows the reader what specifically you're focusing in on. But you notice there's no stance there. There's no opinion in that bridge, because the final sentence of the intro says, a large portion of homelessness is a result of a failed and broken healthcare system in the United States that focuses wrongly on reactive care rather than proactive care. So that's the thesis of the paper. It takes a clear stance. We're very familiar with this issue now. In less than a page, the student has made us familiar with a specific issue, and now we know his opinion on it. What's currently in place is not working because it's reactive. We need something instead that's proactive. That's an argument. Some people would debate that. That's an argument. For this particular paper, you need a connection to the cultural artifact. So the student starts off the next paragraph by saying, demonstrating this issue is the story of Nathaniel Ayers, who began his musical career at a young age playing the double bass at his middle school, but eventually ended up homeless. So you got a clear stance on the real world issue in the thesis, and in the first sentence of the next paragraph, this student introduces the real life story, because the film's based on a true story, connects it to the issue, and then that paragraph is the brief summary I mentioned earlier of the film. So as like a quick side note, if you're trying to figure out how much of my text plot, if I'm doing a film or a show or a video game or a novel, how much do I summarize? About as much as this student does here. It's a great example of that. Now you can certainly mention your cultural artifact in your intro, even in your thesis. You don't have to, as long as very quickly you make clear how the cultural artifact connects to your thesis. The student does that with the great transitional phrase, demonstrating this issue is, fill in the blank. But like I said, there's more than one way to do things. So as long as that connection is clear early on in your paper, you don't have to do it in your intro, and this student did not, but you certainly can. So a good example of more than one way to do things. This is a good example of how to do it one way, but other ways certainly work too, and I believe the other two sample papers get to the artifact in their intro. So you can see that there. All right, so probably one of the biggest questions you have is, how do I integrate my research? There's more than one way to do it. Obviously, I've been using that phrase a lot. The most effective way, in my opinion, is after the intro, before the body of the paper, because you don't want your analysis of the artifact to be bogged down by doing a lot of research. But again, this is just one way to do this. I think it's the best way, but it's certainly not the only way. So it's the way I'm going to demonstrate. But don't think you have to do it this way. You do have to accomplish the things that these couple of paragraphs are going to look at accomplish, but you can accomplish them other ways, is my point. So this student does it by putting kind of like a research section, I'll call it, right after the intro before getting into his analysis of the film. Obviously, if you do that, one of the hardest things to do would be transitioning to that section of the paper. So let's take a look at this student's transition sentence. When looking for answers to this problem, great transition when looking for answers. Tells you what the research is going to cover to this problem. Tells you that we're dealing with the same thing we've been talking about here. Great transition phrase. So find some way to go, like, to kind of sum up what the research is about. Here, summing up the researcher's methods of looking for answers, but also connecting to your thesis. So you want to start the research paragraph by summing up what the research is about, but also showing how the research relates to your thesis. And the student does that well in this sentence. The next thing you need to do is paraphrase what the research says. Put into your own words what the sources say. The student does that well in this example. Deborah DeSantis writes a web article on The Soloist, the film, which uses the story to talk about the need for more supportive housing to help the mentally ill and homeless in Los Angeles. Supportive housing takes a unique approach to combating the homeless and mentally ill issues by combining long-term mental care with low-cost housing. So you can quote from your sources if you do. Keep the quotes brief. What I like about what the student does here is he paraphrases. So he's putting the article's main argument into his own words. And then he goes a step farther in the next sentence and reflects on, kind of analyzes it, gives an evaluation of the research. Although this is a helpful solution to the existing mentally ill, it does not address the steady stream of people becoming homeless and allows the existing mentally ill homeless population to pile up until more and more supportive housing is needed. So what the student's doing here is making a connection to his thesis, because we know his thesis is that we need to be proactive, not reactive. He gives one example of a possible solution here, and it's tied to the movie and it's tied to the sentence before it, so the paper's flowing great. But he points out this is a reactive solution, not a proactive solution, but this is what someone has suggested so far. So it's a great summary of the source, but also connecting it to other parts of the paper. And that's exactly what you should be doing all throughout whatever part of the paper where you talk about the research. What does this source have to say about this topic? How is that similar to what the other sources have to say about this topic? Remember, the sources are talking to each other. So show the connections. Getting down to the student's third and final source, he says about this source, this helps find alternative ways to treat the homeless population requiring care without flooding hospital emergency rooms that are not equipped to deal with mental health or chronic illnesses. But again, disregards acting on the problem before homelessness and hospitalization occur. So the student has basically showed how three sources at this point, and remember, you only need three sources for your paper, all show reactive rather than proactive solutions. That's what they have in common. And he points out they have this in common because he says, uses the word again. So you can devote whole sentences to making connections between sources, but you can also just use one word here or there. And the word again, similar to, agrees with, disagrees with, those types of words are all great examples of words that can help you make connections as you're summing up the arguments of your sources. Now, making connections between the sources is just one part of how you're supposed to use the research. When you make connections, you show how the research is talking to each other. The pieces of research, how they're talking to each other. But remember, the main purpose of the research is not just to support our argument, but to show how our argument is unique. So we outline the conversation, which is what we've seen on the last two slides the student has done, but then we join and add to the conversation. So the student joins the conversation by saying that the overwhelming consensus is that we face a major issue with mental health and homelessness, and that more needs to be done to help the suffering population. All of the sources agree on this. This is a great way of summing up what all three sources have in common, their common ground, in just one sentence. And then he says, with growing homeless rates, it is obvious that our current approach to the problem is not working. So that second sentence of this paragraph then clears the ground for the student to restate his thesis and at the same time show its uniqueness. By more effectively devoting resources to mental health hospitals, research on the illnesses that plague the homeless community, and helping the youth that suffer from mental illness before they reach a crisis stage, we could begin to fight this problem before it leads to homelessness or worse. So reiterating the thesis that we need to be proactive rather than reactive, and doing it after just summing up how three sources on the topic all presented reactive solutions. So this idea of we need to find a proactive solution is really unique. That's this student's niche. That's the unique spot he found to enter the conversation. That's what you need to find, that type of thing, not that exact thing, that type of thing for your topic. How are you adding something new to this conversation? Here the student does that really clearly. So hopefully all of that gives you a really good idea of how to integrate the research into your paper, because that's probably what you were wondering about most. In lesson 4, we went into great detail on how to structure body paragraphs to write analysis. We're just going to review it briefly here because we can never review that too much, and that'll give you kind of a holistic look at this paper, this student paper, and it'll help you see how do I do it where I'm actually using the analysis, not just to tell people what the text is saying, but to tell people how what the text is saying speaks about my issue, right? Because like this movie, right? So the student's got a great unique thesis about how to approach the problem of homelessness in our country. But what does a movie have to do with that? And how can a movie help with that? Because sometimes a picture says 1,000 words. So by analyzing cultural artifact, you can paint a picture for readers. But here's a quick review of the different types of sentences you need to have in a body paragraph and how to specifically do that to help your artifact prove your thesis. So a topical transition sentence, remember, is the opening sentence of the paragraph needs to make an argument, and it can also connect the topic of the current paragraph to the previous one to show the relationships between them. That's what makes it a topical transition. That helps you not only state what the paragraph is about, but transition from paragraph to paragraph. So in this next paragraph, the student says, Steve Lopez's answer to Nathaniel Ayers' illness echoes these major issues facing the country. So that we just read the paragraph where the student talked all about the problem of homelessness, problem of how we're not addressing it correctly, how we should address it instead. So when he says, echoes these major issues, that's a good transition sentence. But the movie, these are real people. Nathaniel Ayers is the character played by Jamie Foxx, who is a real person who had a great, upbringing and potential to be like a world-class musician. But because of his schizophrenia, fell out of music school and ended up homeless after just 1 year. Steve Lopez is the journalist played by Robert Downey Jr. who finds him and connects with him and tries to help him. What the student's saying here is Steve Lopez, what he does to try to help Nathaniel Ayers is the same thing we keep trying to do to help the homeless in our country that only puts a Band-Aid on a bullet wound. And so he's saying this film illustrates my idea. And so there's a clear argument here, making it a topic sentence. There's a clear transition, echoes these major issues from the previous paragraph, so it's a topical transition sentence. Remember, you want your topic sentence, your little mini argument, to be the first sentence of each body paragraph so the reader knows what the paragraph is about. Next, you give an example. This can be a quote. It can just be kind of a quick paraphrase, a summary of something that happens in your cultural artifact. It can be an image. Remember, you got to include a couple images, and you do need to analyze them. So the image itself could be the example, but you need some kind of example or evidence that proves the argument from your topic sentence. In this case, the student says, in The Soloist, Lopez tries to help heirs with drugs and medications without truly trying to understand what Nathaniel's issues are and how he can be of the most help to him. So he just tries to fix the problem without trying to understand the problem. Again, Band-Aid on a bullet wound. This movie is portraying exactly what the student's thesis says. Great example of connecting a real-world issue to a cultural artifact. But this is a summary of what happens in the film. So if the student just ended here, you wouldn't have any analysis. You have to show the reader how the evidence proves your argument from your topic sentence. And so we call those linking sentences, because when you analyze the artifact, you make a link or a connection between the evidence and the argument. So he says this is a perfect example of the United States process to assisting the mentally ill and homeless population. So spells out that thought process clearly for the readers. This guy is trying to get medications that will help alleviate the symptoms Ayers is experiencing, but he isn't getting to know Ayers. He isn't trying to understand him as a person, and that's the lesson Lopez has to learn in the movie. The student's saying, that's the lesson we as a country have to learn as we try to help homeless people. So, really a brief but good analysis here to show how the example proves the argument from the topic sentence, and the connection to the thesis is really clear. You want to make that clear as well. I think you can see how it's clear here. I would normally go in and give you more examples of analysis, because that's the most important part of the paper. But we've already practiced it, and like I said, no paper is perfect. So if I have a critique of this paper, it's that the student does not do enough analysis of the film. So keep that in mind. But I wanted to use this example in the lecture because of the 3 examples, it does the best job of integrating the research, which is the part of this paper I'm assuming you're least familiar with, and you've at least written a rhetorical analysis and at this point gotten feedback from me on it. So you're probably more familiar, is my point, with how to write really good analysis than how to integrate the research. So I wanted the example paper in the lecture to be the one that does the best job of the research. And like I said, each paper has some flaws. So the flaw here is that there's not more analysis than this. So in your paper, look at how this paper does a good job of integrating the research, how the other papers do perhaps a better job of analysis, and then try to do both really well in your paper. Again, this is how we look at examples, as exactly that, as examples, as illustrations, not templates, not formulas. So hopefully looking at this sample paper was really helpful to you. It has a short, sweet conclusion, so if you look at the conclusion, you'll see how that also reflects what I'm looking for. For the discussion board, take an in-depth look at another sample paper so you're just really familiar with a few examples of how to get at the things I'm asking for. And of course, email me with any questions. If you want to have me take a look at your rough draft and give you some feedback before you turn in your final draft, I would love to do that. Just send me an email and let me know. Remember, this discussion board where you look at one of the other sample papers is due Friday instead of Sunday, so that Sunday you can turn in your rough draft. Canvas will give you some peer review partners on Monday afternoon. You have till Friday to do those peer reviews, and then that following Sunday the final draft is due. I very much look forward to reading your discussion board posts and your final drafts. Please reach out to me with questions on anything.